The dawn painted the sky over Sheldon Creek in golden pink hues, but for Grayson Mills, the morning brought far from joyful news. Veterinarian Jacob Everett, adjusting his glasses with professional habit, stood at the door of the old barn, struggling to find the right words. His voice, usually confident, held a shadow of concern. "Grayson," he began, hesitating slightly, "the news is extremely unusual. Your Clover, she's having twins. The chances of such an event are rare, less than 1 in 10,000. Grayson was silent. His weathered, calloused hands gripped the edge of his hat tightly, his gaze fixed on the ground. He couldn't believe his ears. Clover was more than just a horse. She was the heart of the ranch, their hope, and their pride. Losing her would mean losing something far greater than just an animal. Jake continued, "But there's a problem. Such pregnancies almost always end tragically, either for the mother or the foals. I have to be honest. The best option is to terminate one of the pregnancies to save Clover's life." The veterinarian's words struck like a thunderclap. In the house nearby, the curtains rustled. It was Tessa, Grayson's daughter, listening from the window. She rushed to the barn, not bothering about her hair, which was still not tied in its usual braid. Her hazel eyes, like her mother's, sparkled with a mix of horror and determination. "No," she said sharply, bursting in. "We can't do that. Clover is strong, Dad. You yourself said she could handle any challenge. Why are you doubting now?" Grayson looked up, his eyes filled with weariness and doubt. But before he could respond, Jake intervened. "Tessa, understand this isn't about strength. It's a risk. I've seen too many cases where such decisions ended in death." "But doesn't she deserve at least a chance?" the girl insisted, her voice trembling. "You know Clover has fought all her life, Dad. Are you really ready to give up without giving her a chance to prove it?" Tessa's words hung in the air like an echo in the quiet barn. Jake, used to such arguments, did not interfere. He understood that the choice always remained with the family. Grayson was silent for a long time, then looked at his daughter. His face reflected the struggle between fear and hope. "If we decide to leave things as they are," he finally said, his voice low but firm, "it will only be until Clover is in danger. But you must be ready, Tessa. If the time comes, we will have to make a decision." The girl nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She understood that at stake was the life of their Clover, their hopes, and her personal attachment. Ahead were weeks filled with tension and uncertainty. But in Tessa's heart, like Clover's, burned something that would not let her give up. Thus began the battle for life, where every minute, every choice, and every grain of faith mattered. Sheldon Creek held its breath, preparing to witness the most challenging trial to befall the Mills Ranch. In the shadows of the high mountains of Sheldon Creek, the days began to stretch slowly, as if nature itself held its breath, waiting to see how Clover's story would end. The Mills Ranch, usually filled with the sounds of daily work, now seemed strangely quiet. The workers, not knowing what to think, whispered among themselves about Grayson's decision. It seemed to be something more than just a risk. Tessa spent practically all her time with Clover. Veterinarian Jake regularly visited for checkups, monitoring the mare and her foals. Each time, his conclusions were cautious but honest. The pregnancy was progressing, but any complication could be catastrophic. He reminded them of the need to be prepared for tough decisions, but Tessa clenched her lips more stubbornly each time. "She'll make it, Jake," the girl said firmly, not taking her eyes off the horse. Her voice held conviction, but her heart was filled with fear. Grayson, watching his daughter, often wondered if he had done the right thing. He loved Clover, but his love for his daughter was even deeper. He saw how Tessa clung to hope, and it made him continue. But at night alone, sitting by the window with a cup of strong coffee, Grayson increasingly asked himself, what if she's wrong? What if hope costs too much? Meanwhile, Clover's condition began to cause concern. The horse, who usually greeted Tessa with a joyful neigh, now looked tired. Her movements became cautious, her breathing deeper, and her appetite noticeably decreased. The veterinarian, examining her again, was straightforward. "The condition is concerning, Grayson. We need to double our attention to her diet and monitor her activity. Any stress could be decisive." For Tessa, Each new day became a test of endurance. She did everything she could to support Clover, carefully monitored her diet, kept the stall spotless, and even brought flowers to brighten the space where the horse spent most of her time. But deep down, she was tormented by doubt. She tried not to show it, but Grayson knew his daughter too well. One evening, as the sun was almost hidden behind the mountains, Tessa approached her father, who was standing by the fence, watching the pasture. "Dad, do you think we made the right choice?" Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. Grayson looked at her, seeing in her eyes the same mix of stubbornness and fear that was in her natural thoughts. "I don't know, Tess," he admitted after a long pause. "But I know one thing. Sometimes believing is the hardest thing we can do, and it makes us stronger." Tessa changed, hugging her father tightly. In this silent gesture was all their struggle, for Clover's life, for faith in each other, and for not losing hope. Sheldon Creek prepared for a new day, where a victorious minute became part of this story, a story about what it means to fight to the end. With the onset of cooler days, Clover's condition became increasingly fragile. Her appearance was evident. Her eyes dulled, her steps became slow, and her appetite decreased to almost a minimum. For Tessa, a new crack appeared in the familiar picture. Her independence and the mare's grace became a painful reminder that everything could change in an instant. One morning, when Tessa brought a bucket of oats to the stall, she immediately noticed something was wrong. Clover, who usually greeted her with a soft neigh, stood in the stall with her head lowered and her ears pressed back. The girl froze, feeling a chill run down her spine. "What's wrong, girl?" she whispered, carefully approaching. Clover barely raised her gaze, her breathing heavy, her body seemingly having lost its former lightness. Tessa glanced over her shoulder, where her father, who had just turned from the pasture, was already approaching the stall with a serious expression. "Call Jake," Grayson said briefly, not taking his eyes off the horse. The veterinarian arrived quickly, his face, usually calm, now reflecting concern. Examining Clover took no more than 10 minutes, but for Tessa, this time stretched into an eternity. When Jake finally straightened up, his gaze was heavy. "She's exhausted," he said, addressing both Grayson and Tessa. "The weight of the foals is putting a lot of pressure on her body. We need to adjust her diet, add energy supplements, and reduce her activity to a minimum." Grayson slowly nodded, but Tessa couldn't just stand and listen. "What else can we do? Is there anything that can ease her condition?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Everything we can do, we're already doing, Tessa," Jake gently replied, adjusting his glasses. "Now it's up to her. We can only support her and closely monitor her condition." These words sounded like a sentence. Tessa spent the whole day next to Clover, persuading her to eat at least a few handfuls of oats, adding special mixtures to her feed that Jake had brought. But the night brought new trials. On Friday, when Tessa took Clover out for a short walk to let her breathe some fresh air, a rabbit suddenly jumped out of the bushes. The horse, startled, took a sharp step back and slowly slid on the wet ground. Her large body heavily thudded to the side, kicking up a cloud of dust. "Dad!" Tessa screamed, rushing to the mare. "Clover, hold on, please." Grayson and Jake, hearing her scream, suddenly appeared next to her. Jake carefully examined Clover, checking for injuries. His face remained calm, but his eyes held tension. "No internal damage is apparent," he said, getting up. "We need to monitor her constantly. If something goes wrong, we'll need to act immediately." Grayson stood nearby, silently watching Jake's every move. Tessa, sitting on the ground next to Clover, stroked her velvety muzzle and whispered words of comfort. "You're strong, girl. I know you can do it. We're all here for you." That night, no one on the ranch slept. In shifts, the family and workers kept watch by the stall, carefully monitoring the mare's every movement. Tessa stood next to everyone. Her hands could touch the horse, as if she had transferred her strength to her. At dawn, when the veterinarian returned for a re-examination, everyone held their breath. Fortunately, there were no serious injuries, he announced, relieved. "But this is a warning. We can't afford another such incident." These words sounded like a call to action. From that moment on, all life on the ranch changed. Each day began to revolve around Clover. Her stall was equipped to minimize any risks. Grayson, it seemed, no longer let go of the tools, reinforcing the barn walls and improving the roof so that the horse was protected even in the most unpredictable moments. And Tessa? She was tireless. Every hour, every moment of her day was devoted to making Clover feel safe. She talked to the mare, sang her songs, and even brought fresh flowers to brighten the stall. Against the backdrop of all this titanic effort and struggle for life, the ranch froze in anticipation. They knew there would be new challenges ahead, but no one was going to give up. After all, everyone believed, if anyone had a chance to make it, it was Clover. Sheldon Creek met the day that could change everything. From early morning, the air was filled with tension. Grayson, Jake, Tessa, and a few ranch professionals gathered in the barn where Clover's stall was located. Tessa noticed that the mare was restless. Her breathing became heavier, and her movements nervous. Indeed, she felt the inevitable approaching. "It's happening," said Jake, checking Clover's condition. "We need to be ready." Inside the barn, there was complexity. Jake and his assistant quickly prepared everything necessary: clean towels, antiseptics, first aid supplies. Tessa stood next to Clover, her hands gently stroking the mare's neck, calming her. "You can do it, girl," she whispered. "We're all here with you." Grayson watched silently. His face remained expressionless, but his hands, tightly gripping his hat, betrayed his justification. He knew that ahead were long hours, perhaps the most difficult in his life. The veterinarian gave the final instruction and began the birthing process. Clover breathed heavily, her body tensing with pain. Each new contraction made Tessa's heart squeeze. She held on with all her might, but tears could not sparkle in her eyes. Time dragged on painfully long. Minutes seemed like hours as Jake carefully monitored the procedure. His tone was calm, but his movements were quick and precise. "The first foal is on its way," he said. "Everything is going well, but be ready for anything." Clover tensed one last time, and soon the stall was filled with a weak but distinct sound. It was the first neigh of the newborn. Jake quickly caught the tiny creature, carefully cleaned it, and placed it on soft straw next to the mare. "It's a boy," he announced, smiling for the first time all day. Tessa knelt next to Clover, looking at the tiny foal. He was weak but alive. His breathing was shallow but stable. "Ash," she whispered, stroking the baby, "you're a real fighter." However, the trial was not over yet. Jake frowned, looking at Clover. "The second foal is not in an ideal position," he said. "This will be more difficult." Grayson stepped closer, his face becoming even more complex. He understood that the fate of Clover and the second foal was being decided right now. "Can we do something?" he asked, trying to close the tremor in his voice. "Stay close," Jake replied. "I'll do everything I can, but I need you to be ready." The second stage was even more tense. Clover was clearly exhausted, her strength at its limit. Tessa, unable to bear it, pressed herself to the mare's neck, whispering words of support. "Hold on, Clover. You can do it. We believe in you." Jake carefully maneuvered, guiding the foal into the necessary position. The atmosphere in the barn was so filled with tension that it seemed even the air had become heavier. Finally, after a few minutes that seemed like an eternity, the second foal appeared. It was noticeably smaller and weaker, but alive. "It's a girl," Jake said, smiling. "Very fragile, but she'll make it." For the first time all day, Tessa felt the icy lump in her chest begin to melt. She carefully stroked the second foal, her eyes full of tears. "Skylar," she whispered, "you're the strongest of all." Clover, though completely exhausted, turned her head to her foals. In her eyes shone maternal tenderness mixed with sunset. It was a moment of triumph, mixed with the realization of how close they had been to the edge of the abyss. Grayson stepped closer and placed his hand on Tessa's shoulder. "You were right," he said softly. "She did it." Tessa looked at her father, her face expressing gratitude and relief. "No, Dad," she replied. "We all did it." The barn was filled with silence again, but this time it was not anxious but soothing. The story of the region and faith in Sheldon Creek had only just begun, but already the family knew that this day would remain in their memory forever. The birth of the foals became a real miracle for the ranch. However, with it came new worries. Ash and Skylar, two tiny creatures, required constant attention. Tessa did not leave them, caring for every breath. Grayson, though he tried not to show his emotions, often lingered by the stall, watching every movement of the foals and their mother. Ash turned out to be strong and active. By the second day, he was trying to stand on his weak legs, unsteadily swaying and clumsily falling into the soft straw. Skylar, on the other hand, was quiet and weak. Her movements were slow, her breathing strained. Tessa spent a lot of time with her, persuading her to take small but important steps. "You're very strong, girl," she said, sitting next to Skylar. "You can do it. Just trust us." Clover, despite her obvious exhaustion, looked at her foals with tenderness. She seemed to understand that they needed support. Every time Ash wandered too far, she gently nudged him back with a soft push of her muzzle. She tried to encourage Skylar, gently nudging her to stand. Jake visited daily to check on the trio. His expression became even more serious when he examined Skylar. "Her breathing is still labored," he said one morning, addressing Tessa and Grayson. "We need to continue monitoring and provide her with maximum comfort." Tessa's resolve only strengthened. She arranged the stall so that Skylar could rest easily, and the air was fresh and cool. The girl collected fresh herbs for bedding so that the foals felt more comfortable. Grayson, who was always a man of action, now more often came to the stall not with tools but with apples and fresh alfalfa. He silently watched as Ash eagerly ran around the stall, and Skylar slowly took her first steps. Sometimes he made small notes in his pocket notebook, explaining them to no one. "She's low but persistent," he noted one evening as he sat next to Tessa. "There's something special in her." "She's an observer," Tessa replied, stroking the foal's soft mane. "She's learning. She's just waiting for a moment." In the following days, Ash and Skylar began to change their characters. Ash, quick and playful, often tried to jump over small obstacles that Tessa set up for play. Skylar preferred quietness. She slowly approached new objects, studying them with caution and interest. Their contrast became a topic of conversation among the ranch representatives. "Ash is a hurricane," one of them laughed, "and Skylar is like a quiet stream, slow, but no less beautiful." Meanwhile, Clover's health slowly improved. She began to eat more, and her coat regained its healthy shine. Grayson watched this with relief, but did not relax. "We can't let our guard down," he said to Tessa one morning as they cleaned the stall together. "We've only gone halfway." Tessa smiled, but there was already a light smile on her face. She felt they were moving in the right direction. Each new day brought small but victories, whether it was Skylar's first confident step or another one of Ash's jumps. One of those days, Jake, watching the foals, unexpectedly smiled. "They're stronger than I thought," he said, patting Grayson on the shoulder. "Your family is incredible. But remember, this is just the beginning. They still have a lot ahead of them." These words stuck in Grayson's head as he watched the foals play. He knew that ahead of them were new challenges, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of confident calm. In their family, in Clover, and in the two tiny foals, there was a strength capable of overcoming any challenge. The story of Clover and her foals quickly spread beyond Sheldon Creek. It all started with photographs that Tessa took one quiet evening. Ash and Skylar stood next to Clover, their silhouettes outlined against the setting sun. This image was so touching and symbolic that Tessa couldn't help but publish it on social media with the caption, "Strength, hope, and all of this in one family." The photograph went viral within days. People from all over the country began sharing it, marveling at the rare case of twin foals being born to a horse. The Mills Ranch suddenly found itself in the spotlight. Journalists, bloggers, and animal rights activists wanted to know more about Clover, her foals, and the people who supported them on this difficult journey. The first morning when strangers appeared at the ranch gates was an unpleasant surprise for Grayson. He stood on the porch and watched as cars approached the gates. Cameras, bags, and things began to fill the space, disturbing the familiar peace. "We won't be able to handle this," he muttered, shaking his head. However, Tessa saw the situation differently. She saw in this unexpected fame an opportunity to tell the world that even in the most difficult circumstances, one can find the strength to fight. "Dad, this is a good thing," she said, trying to reassure him. "We can inspire people, show that miracles are possible." "Miracles require peace, Tessa," Grayson replied. "Clover and the foals need rest, not cameras." They agreed to limit access to the ranch, so journalists were only allowed to visit on certain days and only on the condition that their presence did not disrupt the living conditions of the animals. But even with these measures, the attention became burdensome. Each time strangers entered the territory, Clover became anxious, and Skylar began to get nervous. Even the active and brave Ash felt the tension. One morning, when photographers were setting up a shoot in the barn, Tessa noticed that Skylar was breathing heavily, her movements slow. The girl instantly realized that something was wrong. She stopped the shoot and urgently called Jake. The veterinarian arrived within an hour. After examining Skylar, he said, "Her body is still very fragile. Stress can greatly affect her condition. We need to urgently assess any irritating factors." Tessa felt accused. She realized that the attention to their story could turn against them. She approached her father, who was reinforcing the fence near the barn at the time. "Dad, you were right," she said softly. "It was too much. We need to stop everything before it gets worse." Grayson looked at her with understanding and, nodding, set aside his tools. "All right, Tess. We'll close the ranch to visitors until the foals get stronger." The next day, the Mills Ranch was closed to the public. Tessa posted a message on social media, explaining that the health of the animals was most important to them, and thanked everyone for their support. In response, she received many warm words and thanks, as well as assurances that their decision was completely understandable. Meanwhile, life on the ranch returned to its usual rhythm. Clover became calm again, and Skylar began to gradually recover. Ash, as always, eagerly ran around her, trying to inspire his sister with his inventions. "They're back to their strength," Jake said, watching the foals. "They just need a little more time." Tessa and Grayson watched their horses with relief. Despite the attention and difficulties, it also reminded them of the main thing. Family and health are the most important. In those days, filled with work, care, and hope, they began to see that the future could indeed be bright. Weeks passed, filled with meticulous care and recovery. The attention to Clover and her foals gradually faded, leaving the Mills Ranch in its desired state. Ash and Skylar gained strength, their characters becoming even more evident. Ash was the embodiment of energy, his playfulness and courage inspiring. Skylar, on the other hand, stood quietly, observant, but in each of her steps, one could read grace and incredible inner strength. Tessa started each morning by watching the foals. She loved to see how Ash jumped around the pasture, trying to entertain his sister with his antics. Skylar did not always pay attention to his calls, but if she decided to, her movements were delicate and purposeful. One morning, when Tessa brought fresh alfalfa, she noticed that Clover was looking at her foals with special tenderness. It was a look full of pride and love. Tessa couldn't help but smile, feeling that all their efforts had not been in vain. "You did it, girl," she said softly, stroking the mare's neck. "You showed everyone that the impossible is possible." Meanwhile, Grayson, who had been keeping a low profile all this time, was preparing his garden surprise. He was working on creating a new area on the ranch territory, which he called Clover's Refuge. It was a quiet place, specially equipped for the animals to rest, where they could feel completely safe. "This is for her," he said to Tessa one day, showing her the new enclosure. "For her foals, and for all who will be born here on our ranch." Tessa looked at her father with gratitude. She knew that this project was his way of expressing his feelings, his love, and pride for his family. The day came when Jake announced that Clover and her foals had fully recovered. It was a small but important event for everyone on the ranch. Tessa, Grayson, and the workers organized a small celebration to mark this triumph. Ash and Skylar seemed equally deep. They galloped around the pasture, their movements full of joy and energy. "Look at them, Dad," Tessa said, her voice trembling with emotion. They're so different, but that's their strength. They complement each other. Grayson was silent, watching the foals. His gaze stopped on Skylar, who paused in her games, raised her head, and looked at her father and daughter. In her eyes was the same quiet fire that had helped her stand her ground. "She's an observer," he finally said. She understood everything. The story of Clover and her foals remained not only on the pages of social media, but also in the hearts of people who learned about this miracle. Tessa decided to write a book to preserve the memories of what they had been through. She titled it Clover's Last Chance. "It's not just about horses," she explained to her father, showing him the first draft. "It's about us, about family, about how we fought together." The book quickly found a response among readers. Its words inspired and touched hearts, reminding people that even in the most difficult circumstances, one can find the strength to fight. And Clover? She continued to live her life, protecting Ash and Skylar. Her story became a symbol of resilience, and her offspring, a reminder that miracles are possible. Sheldon Creek regained its quiet, but in this quiet, there was a new strength, the strength of family, faith, and love, which helped to overcome a difficult task.